Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about finally the Canelo Alvarez situation. And unfortunately, I could not talk about it a lot when it ended up happening because I did contract that of the COVID-19 virus, which of course did, put me out overall, pretty much for a couple of weeks. But now that overall that I'm feeling much better, I thought that I would finally talk about this little situation. And in this video, we're going to be talking about a multitude of things. We're going to be talking about Canelo Alvarez's career. Do I believe that Canelo Alvarez was overrated by the media? Do I believe that Canelo is not a great fighter? Or, basically certain things about Canelo. And also about that of the Dimitri Bivol performance and what Canelo Alvarez should do next within his career. Well, anyways, just to get this video started and just to get straight to the point, the big question is about Canelo Alvarez. If you're asking me, do I believe that Canelo Alvarez's career was more smoke and mirrors or more of a facade than when it was reality? If you're asking me overall that question, well, if you've seen my videos about Canelo in the past, you pretty much already know my answer to that question. And overall, the answer is no. I don't think that Canelo Alvarez's career was smoke and mirrors or a facade. A lot of people, of course, especially certain LDBC and new media channels, let's be real, they tried to tear down Canelo Alvarez because they did not want a fighter of his complexion to be the number one pound for pound fighter. It's the same reason why they tore down Vasily Lomachenko a lot of the times, Gennady Triple G Golovkin, and more than likely are going to try and tear down Alexander Usyk if a lot of people are going to rank him now as the current number one pound for pound fighter. Basically, any fighter that is not a black American fighter overall that is ranked as the number one pound for pound fighter, they try to tear them down. All right, that's basically what their main objective is. Now, don't get me wrong. Now that Canelo Alvarez has been dethroned overall, in my opinion, as the number one pound for pound fighter, can you debate that either Terrence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. could now be the number one pound for pound fighter? You certainly could. I think that there are four fighters now, at least on my list, that would be within the mix of the number one pound for pound fighter. When you talk about resume, when you talk about accomplishments, when you talk about a certain amount of everything, one of those fighters would be Terrence Bud Crawford. Another one of those fighters would be Errol Spence Jr. I also think that Alexander Usyk, especially with that victory over Anthony Joshua, that he at least deserves to be within the conversation. And same with Tyson Fury. And a lot of people would not agree with that of Tyson Fury. But Tyson Fury is clearly the best and the greatest heavyweight of this generation. He's beat almost every A-grade heavyweight besides that of AJ and Alexander Usyk. He ended up dominating Deontay Wilder in each and every fight. And he also ended up embarrassing Vladimir Klitschko and also embarrassing Dillian White, who is one of the top contenders. So Tyson Fury, in my view, is up there within my top four pound for pound. And Canelo Alvarez, where does that leave him? Well, Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, now that he ended up losing to Dimitri Bivol in that fashion, Canelo Alvarez is still debatably within my top four, top five pound for pound. But right now, he can no longer be the number one pound for pound fighter. Not unless maybe he avenges that Dimitri Bivol loss, and even then, you can debate that the loss that it pretty much has counted overall, or that it pretty much overall has cost him that number one pound for pound spot. And I do believe that facing Dimitri Bivol was a chase for greatness. Of course, there's going to be a certain amount of channels that tell you, oh, well, he should have fought Charlo or Benavidez. But I'm sorry, but Benavidez and Charlo, I've just never been overly impressed with them. David Benavidez, in my opinion, is a straightforward, one-dimensional fighter. And Jamel Charlo, to be quite honest with you, I think that he's a decent fighter, but he's not really much better overall than that of his lighter brother. And, it just is what it is. I've seen both Charlo brothers perform, in some of their biggest fights. And I'm sorry, but I've just never been overly impressed with them. And if you need proof, go ahead and take a look at Jamal Charlo in the Juan Macias Montiel fight. Go ahead and take a look at him in the Matt Korobov fight. Go ahead and take a look at him in a few other fights in his career. Jamal Charlo is not a guy, in my opinion, that was anywhere near the threat of a Dimitri Bivol. But the question is now about Mr. Canelo Alvarez. And also just to talk about this, just to cap it off, at least this first part, do I still believe that Canelo Alvarez is an all-time great Mexican fighter or an all-time great fighter in general? Absolutely, no doubt about it. There's a lot of people, of course, that would say, oh, well, how dare you compare Canelo to that of Marquez or Chavez or all these other guys? Well, let's be real about some of these Mexican fighters here for a minute. Because a lot of people, of course, are casting stones or criticizing Canelo Alvarez. And if you want to criticize him for losing, no problem with that. All right, no problem with that, because the performance, to be quite honest with you, was downright awful. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. But to basically say that Canelo, that he was never even above some of these other Mexican fighters like Marquez and De La Hoya, no, like I said, the only Mexican fighter in history that, in my view, would debatably even be over Canelo would be Julio Cesar Chavez. That would be the only one. And the reason why that is because there's no other Mexican fighter in the history that could have gone up the weight divisions like what Canelo Alvarez has done and was able to beat those fighters. People act like Marquez and De La Hoya, like they were able to move up the weight divisions and just dominate the weight divisions. That's not what happened. Juan Manuel Marquez ended up losing to Manny Pacquiao the majority of the time and in fair fights. All right, when Julio Cesar Chavez moved up to face Oscar De La Hoya, he ended up getting dominated. When Oscar De La Hoya pretty much did the same move that Canelo Alvarez did when he fought Bernard Hopkins, he ended up getting knocked out and he ended up getting crumpled over like he had a hangover. So, like I said, a lot of people, they'll say, oh, well, Canelo, he's not greater than these guys. On what occasion? On what proof? On what note? Because a lot of these Mexican fighters, they could not even do what Canelo Alvarez could do. In fact, had they been in the Dimitri Bivol fight in a similar situation, they probably would have not even survived the fight. So it just is what it is. But anyways, just to talk about Canelo Alvarez, yes, I still do believe that Canelo is an all-time great fighter. I believe all in all that he did deserve to be the number one pound-for-pound fighter. But that was then and this is now. And right now, Canelo Alvarez, he cannot claim to be, in my opinion, the number one pound-for-pound fighter. And if you're going to defeat Dimitri Bivol in a rematch, and I've seen Canelo Alvarez recently state that he believes that he won the fight 7 rounds to 5, I know for a fact that Canelo Alvarez does not truly 100% believe that he won that fight 7 rounds to 5 because of the way that he is acting. And if Canelo Alvarez, and just like I told Deontay Wilder, just like I told Teofimo Lopez, just like I said about Vasily Lomachenko, about fighters that make excuses after they end up losing a fight, and I get it, because certain fighters, when it comes down to it, they're very prideful, right? I get it. There's nothing worse than getting your ass kicked overall or losing a fight overall in front of thousands upon millions of people. I understand. But at the end of the day, if you are going to beat Dimitri Bivol in a rematch, you have to be extremely honest with yourself. You have to be brutally honest with yourself. The performance that Canelo Alvarez put on in this fight was really, really piss poor. It just is what it is. It probably was the worst performance of Canelo Alvarez's career. And a certain amount of people may say, well, what about the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight? You certainly could argue that that is the most dominant loss that Canelo Alvarez has ever had in his career. But just in terms of the way that Canelo Alvarez looked extraordinarily bad in this fight. At least in the Mayweather fight, Canelo Alvarez, yes, he lost almost every single round, if not every single round in my opinion. But Canelo Alvarez, at least someone looked in, I'm not going to say tip-top shape completely, but he looked in pretty decent shape. In this fight, he looked lethargic. He looked slow. He looked like he had no stamina after that 4th round. No stamina whatsoever. And I noticed it very, very early on. He was breathing from his mouth very heavily when it came down to it. Canelo Alvarez had no stamina to continue on in this fight whatsoever. And overall, if Canelo Alvarez is going to win the rematch, he's not going to win the rematch by making excuses. He's not going to win the rematch overall by just stating that, oh, I thought that I won the fight 7 rounds to 5 or this or that. No, you lost the fight because, first of all, you gain way too much muscle mass. That is the first thing. You need to get down to a weight, all in all, that is comfortable for you. Overall, the same weight that you were at, either at 160 or 168. I think that it's very clear that Canelo Alvarez, that he thought the only way to defeat Dimitri Bivol was basically to add on extra muscle mass so he can knock him out either early or overall make him fear his power. And if you're going to defeat a fighter like Dimitri Bivol, you're going to have as much stamina as what you possibly need, because Dimitri Bivol is a person that he has a great power, he has a great boxing ability. All right, Dimitri Bivol, he is an A+ boxer. All right, he's not a Jamel Charlo. All right, he's not a David Benavidez. This is not just a guy, all in all, in my opinion, that you're going to back up with your power. All right, this is a guy that you have to be very crafty with him. And Canelo Alvarez, unfortunately, I think he came in completely with the wrong game plan. And in order to defeat Dimitri Bivol as well, you are going to have to pressure him. You are going to have to pressure him. He was successful in some of the early rounds when he was pressuring Dimitri Bivol. But basically, when he thought of backing up and trying to out-counter Dimitri Bivol, that's not going to work. At least it's not going to work with you against Dimitri Bivol, because Bivol is too quick, he's too strong when it comes down to it, and he's too big. So if Canelo Alvarez is going to defeat Dimitri Bivol, that's not me saying sometimes that you may not want to back up, but Canelo, what he's mainly going to have to do is that he's mainly overall going to have to lose that weight. He's going to have to lose some of that muscle mass. I have no idea why he thought that would be a good idea coming into this fight. And then on top of that, you're going to have to pressure Dimitri Bivol a certain amount of the times in this fight. Canelo Alvarez's defense, I thought, was very good within the first couple of rounds, but because he lost so much stamina, pretty much after, those couple of rounds, he had no defense to speak of pretty much in any other round. And some people may say, well, Canelo Alvarez, when it comes down to it, why do you think that he was so hittable in the latter rounds? Because you said that you think that Canelo Alvarez, that he is a great defensive fighter. Well, he is a great defensive fighter. The problem is that he gained so much weight that when it comes down to it, that he pretty much lost all stamina. He lost all his conditioning. And if you know anything about boxing, when it comes down to when you lose all stamina, the defense is going to start to go. And the reason why that is because it takes energy to keep your hands up consistently. It takes energy to block punches. It takes energy overall to defend certain shots, certain combinations. And that's why Canelo Alvarez was getting hit so easily in this fight, because his stamina was downright awful. It was awful. It just is what it is. So in this video, this is pretty much a video that would help Canelo Alvarez, at least in my view, because Canelo Alvarez is not going to win the Dimitri Bivol rematch if he even wants to take the rematch. When it comes down to it, he's not going to win the Dimitri Bivol rematch by lying to himself and other people's lying to him. Just like when people tried to lie to Deontay Wilder when he ended up losing, or lied to Teofimo Lopez, or lied to Vasily Lomachenko. Even though a lot of people, they didn't really try to lie to those fighters. The fighter mainly that I'm talking about that people were lying to was Deontay Wilder. And that's the reason why Deontay Wilder, he made no adjustments whatsoever, because basically he thought, especially from these dumbass fans that tried to tell him that, he needed to make no adjustments whatsoever, that he pretty much overall, only lost because he was cheated. Well, he ended up figuring out that Tyson Fury was just all around the better fighter. And if Canelo Alvarez does not make adjustments, he may find himself losing to Dimitri Bivol the second time. Because Dimitri Bivol now has the confidence. He ended up winning it in the first fight. It's going to be 10 times harder, in my opinion, now for Canelo to win a rematch. So we'll see what ends up happening. But it should be very interesting. We'll see what ends up happening. Hopefully, Canelo Alvarez, in my view, I would like to see a Dimitri Bivol rematch, but he is going to have to make a certain amount of adjustments. He is. Especially with that stamina. He has to lose some of that muscle mass, no doubt about it, because you had no stamina. You had no stamina whatsoever. But we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see what happens with Mr. Sul Canelo Alvarez. But that's about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.